Good evening, everybody. My name is Jane Stevenson of Seminars.ie, and I think probably a lot of you have come to other events I've done in the past. You're very, very welcome to this conversation between Robert Fisk and Conor O'Clery. Well, I was absolutely delighted when Robert accepted this invitation to speak this evening. In this age of media bias, fake news, distorted truths, Trumpisms, it is great to have a shining light of journalists with integrity who are not so-called hotel journalists who go and hunker down in a hotel. Robert Fisk actually gets out there to the trouble spots of the world, and he reports directly back. And in this way, he's a really genuinely, fantastically straightforward journalist. And as you probably know, his expertise has been in the Middle East, and he's actually met Osama bin Laden, and he's been at the hot spaces of the Middle East. But he's also reported from all around the world, as you will see from his newspaper columns in The Independent. And who better person to be part of this conversation with him than Conor O'Clery, who is the former senior foreign correspondent of the Irish Times. And he is also an award-winning journalist and has reported from all over the world, including Russia, and he reported on the 9/11 attacks in New York. So it's really a great privilege to have these eminent journalists here together. They both have written books, as you will see, and they will sign books afterwards, after these talks. The format of this talk is, it's a conversation. So it's a free-flowing conversation between the two, and then there will be questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we will get a microphone to you. And we expect that to be quite an interesting part of this evening as well. So please turn off your mobile phones. I am recording this, so it will eventually end up on YouTube at some point. So you don't need to record it. So please turn off your phones. It'd be very grateful if you could do that. And please welcome Robert Fisk and Conor O'Clery.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. You all know Robert. You've heard his voice on radio. You've heard a brief summary of his contribution to journalism over the years. He has won International Journalist of the Year 7 times. 7 times. What happened during those other years, Robert?
It's been a few fallow years since, yes. Conor.
He's written one of the most acclaimed books on the Middle East, which is here, which is 1,366 pages, and is really hard to read in bed.
But I'm at present on page 1,565 of the manuscript of the next book, which is a sequel. So I do not expect you or advise you to buy it.
But let's find out something about Robert Fisk, the person. Robert, Bob, actually everybody just calls him Fisk. Bob, let's go back to Maidstone in Kent, where you come from.
Mm-hmm.
And you've spoken very movingly about your father and his influence on you and how how it affected your war reporting in later years. So,
well, my dad was born in 1899. There's not many people here who can say that their fathers were born in the century before last. He joined the British Army in the First World War. He was desperate to go to France. He almost made it. He would have been in the first Battle of the Somme, 20,000 British and Irish dead in the first 24 hours. Mercifully, Padraig Pearse decided to have a rising in Dublin, and the British Army sent him to Ireland. And I always say that Padraig Pearse probably saved his life, and mine too. He was actually ended up billeted down in Victoria Barracks, County Cork, now of course Collins Barracks. And then he was sent to France for the Third Battle of the Somme. And he talked about it when he thought he was dying of cancer in the 60s, 70s. He wasn't, but he thought he was. And I asked him, by the way, will you tell me what the First World War was about? And he said, all it was, fella, was a great waste. Interestingly, when I first went to the Middle East, and I went straight into the Lebanon Civil War, and then I was in the Iran-Iraq War, and then I was covering, of course, Afghanistan, and Conor and I were together in much of this. We started together, of course, in Belfast. My father didn't mind or fear for me. He used to say, don't worry about shell fire. You can't do anything about it, but watch out for snipers. And it turned out to be very good advice. If they're looking to kill you, they probably will, but watch out. As far as shells, what can you do? When I cover Syria today, my wife goes with me to take photographs for The Independent. We take exactly the same view, and we can hear snipers very quickly. My wife will say, watch out on the left. Her view is that 4 eyes are better than 2. It sounds as if it comes from George Orwell, but it's correct. But my father, he left me when he died in 1992, aged 93, of course, a vast series of books on the First and Second World Wars. And during my school days, I had absorbed them. So that by the time I left school, I knew the stories of the First and Second World War. I knew about the Korean War. I was thirsty for knowledge of the Vietnam War because my dad actually wanted to be a regular army officer. He wanted to be in the Gurkhas. But at the end of the First World War, he was ordered to command a firing party to execute what he said a British soldier. I found out he was actually Australian who had shot dead a British army officer in Paris when he was drunk. He was a young man, 18. And my father refused to command the firing party. And the result was that he was cashiered out of the army. When he was much older, he became extremely right-wing, nationalist, almost fascist. I began to hate him. And when he was dying in Maidstone, Kent, I refused to go and see him. I should have done, but I didn't. But in my book, Great War for Civilisation, this is not an advertisement for the book, I devote a chapter to his life in the First World War and afterwards, and with my mother, which I think was probably my way of saying sorry, you know. But he was the man who made me so interested in history and reading great books. So, what do I say? Thanks, Dad, but I think he didn't want a son. I think he wanted an aide-de-camp, an ADC. And that was probably a mistake.
Well, what he got was a journalist.
Which he sometimes was... He didn't like me becoming a journalist until I joined the Times and went to Belfast. And then he could say, my boy is on the Times. Not, alas, the Irish Times, which is infinitely better, especially today.
Well, that's how you and I met.
It is indeed.
I was there for the Irish Times, 1973, Belfast, the height of the Troubles. You were there for the Times. It was your first experience of blood and killings. Yeah. But you know, an interesting thought struck me when I was thinking about this evening. We in Ireland had a rather jaundiced view of English journalists before the Troubles. My editor used to keep a little poem on his desk under the glass top, which said, thank God you cannot bribe or twist the average English journalist. By seeing what unbribed he'll do, there never is occasion to. But the
British
generation...
journalist, actually, not English, but you've got it spot on.
Yes, the generation of journalists that came to Belfast, yourself, Max Hastings, David Blundy, you challenged authority. You were fearless, and I think that this may have laid the groundwork for your career as a war correspondent, as a correspondent of conflict, and shaped your attitude to power, to holding power to account.
I think you're probably right. I'd have to say, to keep it historically correct, that most of my colleagues went along with the army line and the government line.
No, I'm talking about a small group.
Yes, it was a very small
group. A very special group.
And what I found, and I still find it in the Middle East now, is that when you deviated from the government, I'm talking about the British or UK Army line, your colleagues went for you like rats. And in the Middle East today, if I write something that is not generally accepted by Western governments, my colleagues attack me in exactly the same way, 45, 46 years later. Being a journalist, if you try to do your job properly, is bloody hard. At the same time, and I have to say, Conor was one of the journalists who taught me a lot. There were two things I learned, first of all, in Northern Ireland. One, the British government lies, as well as everyone else, but the authorities lie. And the second thing was, keep in touch and talk to and be friends with the Irish journalists. Because most British journalists had a jaundiced view of you lot, but I did not. And I'll tell you one reason why not, and this is a little anecdote about you. When the names were about to be announced of the first Northern Ireland Assembly government, Brian Faulkner, Paddy Devlin, he tipped me off that he would probably get the names from Paddy Devlin at 11:15 at night. And at 11:15, he called me and he said, Bob, I got the list. I said, Conor, give it to me. And I trusted him completely because his contacts were really good, you see. And I filed the story to the Times and it went on the front page. And in the morning, the editor rang me from London. He said, Bob, I've got to say to you, look, that was a brilliant exclusive. No other British paper has got any story like this. And he said, how'd you get it? I said, very highly placed sources. And it was him at 11:15 at night.
Actually, Robert, you challenge authority so much. I know you love documents, and you got your hand in some documents once that caused such alarm in Belfast that you were about to be arrested and you had to seek refuge in the Republic.
I did indeed.
What was that all about?
Well, basically, what had happened was that a British Army intelligence officer, whom I knew, wanted me to publicise the fact that the British government were holding meetings at the Northern Ireland office near Stormont in Belfast, in which they were planning to, in some way, set up Northern Ireland politicians and in compromising sexual situations. At the time, the documents that I got hold of, which were pushed through my letterbox, merely said that they were planning to blackmail Northern Ireland politicians, particularly Protestant politicians, as it happens. At the time, the Northern Ireland office regarded the Protestants as being those horrible guys who won't play along with the UK government line. And I, by chance, had gone to London the previous day, so I never got the documents. When I arrived home in Hillsborough, County Down, there was nothing through the door. So I said, well, maybe the guy forgot. 6 o'clock next morning, IUC Special Branch, knocking on the door. Mr. Fisk, we believe you're responsible for receiving documents, the property of Her Majesty's government. Would you come down to Castlereagh Police Station? And I said, I'm really not going to come now. I just don't have the time. I said, well, I'll pop down about 10 or 11 o'clock if that's all right. He said like this. He said, would you recognise this? I said, well, give it to me. He said, I can't show you official secrets out. I said, well, what's the point of asking me such a stupid question? I mean, I can't even see it. In fact, it was the identity of the source. And I didn't even ring London. They left. There were 3 of them. And I got in the car, I piled everything. I lived in a cottage in Hillsborough, just behind Long Kesh, actually. And I got every one of my documents, files, archives on everything, and put it in the back of the car. And I drove like hell for the border. And I went through the last British checkpoint after Newry. Some of you who will know that road very well know that the rocket wire is still on the top of the hill on the left as you go up. And I got to, I got as far as Balbriggan, and I managed to get my editor on the phone. These were the days when, it's bing, 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 bing phones. And I got through to Charles Douglas Hume, who was the editor, and who, despite the fact that he was an aristocrat, he was the nephew of Alec Douglas Hume. He said, what was on the piece of paper they showed you? And I said, the letters, I think it was Public Relations Int or something, PR Int. He said, they got him. He said, they'll get him. So I said, look, I'm going to Dublin. And he said, quite right. Keep on to Ireland. Tell the government what's happened. Tell them you're there. And tell them you want to be safe. And I checked into, was it behind the American Embassy? Was it
Burlington, maybe?
No. It was the International Hotel at some point. Anyway, you got it right. And I checked in there, and I called John Swift at the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I got a message to Garret Fitzgerald, who was then Minister for Foreign Affairs. And I called up the Defence Forces of the Irish Army, because I had done several stories out of Dublin. And an Irish Army intelligence officer met me at a hotel in central Dublin, the Shelburne actually. And John Swift came round to my hotel, and he said, you're safe, but don't go back to Belfast at the moment. I said I wouldn't intend to. At that point, the British, he's in fact the senior British intelligence officer at the British Embassy in Dublin, turned up at my hotel. I came down into the lobby. He said, you have documents belonging to Her Majesty's government, and you will hand them over to me at once. And I said, out. He said, I have every right to speak to a British citizen because I'm a British citizen and we represent your government. And I said, out. He said, look, we're going to go up to your room. I said, if you don't leave now, I'm going to call the guards. And he left, like that. And I spent many weeks in the Republic. I wasn't very worried, although I have to tell you that at the time it wasn't as funny as it might seem now. And in fact, what eventually, even when I had to go to the United States during this period, the government, and Garret was among those advising, said, fly Aer Lingus and fly Aer Lingus back and check in with the Irish at the United Nations. Do not go near the British when you're in America. I said, believe me, I won't. And eventually what happened, strangely, and I won't go on too long with the anecdote, I found an envelope when I got back in my hotel room in Dublin inviting me to meet the chief constable of the RUC in Belfast for tea.
For tea.
Sir Graham
for tea.
Shillington.
For tea. Yeah. What? For a cup of tea.
Well, he served the tea when I got there. I called London and they said, cross way down on the border at an unapproved road. I crossed the border at Black Lion, which is on the Irish side, isn't it? And I got back to Belfast. I went straight to police headquarters in Knott Road. This is the RUC, of course, not the Northern Police Service. And I was taken straight to his room. Robert, we've never had the chance of meeting. Graham Shillington, sit down. Do you take your tea with sugar? And do I call you Robert or Bob? And I thought, this is getting incredible, And it quickly emerged. He never mentioned a word about what had happened. Not a word. But I worked out very quickly. He realized that British Army intelligence was using the RUC and he wanted to be far away from it. And I said, I'd like a special patrol group trip in Anderson's Town tonight, and I got it like that. And that was the end. Since then, of course, and I don't want to romanticize this because I don't think about it all the time, it occurred to me, what kind of country is it where government forces interrogate and try to force you to give away secrets, and who want to insinuate that you're a criminal, and who force you to seek immediate sanctuary in another country? And then I always thought, and I still think, what a government to say, welcome, Bob, stay here.
Well, moving right along from your time as a political refugee in Dublin.
That's what I was, actually.
Our careers diverged. You went to Portugal to cover the revolution, and then I think your editor invited you to a posting which would have sunshine and some adventure, which would be Beirut.
It was, yes.
And we came across each other once or twice. I was sent out on assignment for brief periods to Afghanistan and to Iran and to Iraq. But I must tell you, the first time we went to Afghanistan together almost, well, maybe a day or two in between, it was when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan at the end of 1979. And I learned a lesson there which stuck to me to this day. First of all, it was very difficult to get in. I had to make our way. I was with a New York Times journalist up through the Salang Pass, up through the Khyber Pass, and into Kabul. There was a lot of shooting going on. There were a lot of missiles being fired in the hills. There were a lot of gunships. And I made my way to the Intercontinental Hotel in Kabul, and I found the bar. And in the bar, I found Gareth Fitzgerald's brother, Pierce Fitzgerald, and his daughter, Pamela, enjoying a gin and tonic. And I thought, well, that diminishes my great achievement somewhat. But the point I want to make is this, that in my brief, I went to Afghanistan about 4 times. And the second time I went to Afghanistan, I went in as a mujahideen with the robes, as a guest of Hezbi Islami group, who were conducting a war against the Soviet army of occupation. And the commander to whom I spoke, I asked him, what is your war aim? And I thought he was saying to get rid of the Russians, the Shouravi. But he said, no. He said, I want an Afghanistan where there are no non-believers. I want an Islamic State. And the second part of this story is, some years later, just before the Russians withdrew, the Russians took me to the city of Khost, which was under siege from the Islamic fighters in the hills. And there were regular missiles being fired into the town. And I interviewed there a school teacher. And the school teacher reminded me of my mother, who was a school teacher. She was wearing tweeds like my mother used to wear. And she told me, if the Mujahideen win this war, I will have to close my school and all the little girls I'm teaching will not be able to go to school. Now, what struck me at that point, we always thought the Mujahideen were the good guys. They're fighting the Russians. The Americans were arming them. But the result of the Americans arming the Mujahideen, and the Saudi Arabians, of course, was that Afghanistan ceased to be a secular country, and for many years wasn't.
And Ronald Reagan called the Mujahideen founding fathers. He compared them to the US founding fathers.
That's almost hard to believe.
Yeah, but I mean, Trump outdoes this by mirages. You know. Let me tell you a story that ties in with this. Outside Jalalabad, and this is in the first 6 months of the war, in a village outside, there was a mixed school run by husband and wife teachers. And the Mujahideen went into that village. This is very early on. And they closed down the school. They took the husband and the wife and hanged them from trees outside and set them on fire. I sent a message to London saying we should cover this story. I said, it doesn't seem likely, Bob. You see, they were heroes, right? And I said, I'm going to try and get there. So I went down to Jalalabad on that horrible road through the Kabul Gorge. And I got to the village on a little tok-tok with an Afghan translator, because I can't speak Dari or Persian or Pashto. And I got to the school, and the bodies had been taken down. So I went to see the Mukhtar of the village, the Maulavi, in fact, it's different in the Dari language, the religious chairman of the village. And I found myself sitting stupidly cross-legged on the floor in his house, saying, look, what's wrong with educating women as well as men and educating them together? They just sat there and stared at me. And I realized that I had as much chance of convincing them of the advantages of joint education as I could have had trying to persuade Henry VIII of the benefits of democracy. Or Oliver Cromwell, the benefits of rules of war, for example. And that's when I realized very early on in my career as a foreign correspondent, give up on the preachy bit. These people have got to make their decisions themselves, and you mustn't interfere. It will never work. And I've spent the rest of my career trying to persuade people that this is true. And we must talk later about ISIS and how ISIS came about and how it was created. But Afghanistan was a very important war at that stage.
At a later stage in the 1990s, you actually interviewed Osama bin Laden before people in the West, before anybody in America even knew his name. You interviewed him 3 times.
No, they knew his name, but they didn't know where he was.
Well, a few people knew his name. A lot of people in responsible positions in the American administration hardly knew his name, didn't know the threat that he posed. Is it true that he tried to convert you to Islam?
I think so. What happened was that I went to see him. This is a third trip I met him. And he, at the beginning of the conversation, there were lots of Al-Qaeda people sitting around with their rifles and so on. He said, one of our brothers had a dream. Dreams are very important in Islam and very dangerous in my view. That you arrived on a horse, symbol of valor and courage, dressed in Islamic clothes. Plan for Mr. Bob. And I thought, Jesus, how can I deal with this? What do I say to all these Al-Qaeda? And all of them, all these Al-Qaeda guys sort of looked at Mr. Bob, you see. And I heard my voice say, I am not a Muslim, Mr. bin Laden. I am a journalist and my job is to tell the truth. And they all looked back at bin Laden and he said, that is the same as being a good Muslim. I think he was sniffing out to see if I might become a good pilot for an aeroplane. This would be much later on, of course. And that's one reason why I thought, I was actually crossing the Atlantic on 9/11. I thought, this is bin Laden. He's got someone turned, he's got people into the States. And I'm still sure it was bin Laden. You know, the fake news organization will tell you, oh no, it's the Americans and Israelis and all other rubbish. But that was a very important moment because he also said to me, he was quite frightened of the Taliban at the time. He said, Mr. Robert, I pray that God permits us to turn America into a shadow of itself. That was 5 years before 9/11. So when it happened, you know.
Well, of course he tried, and he certainly turned parts of New York into rubble.
Yes, he did. When I got back, because the plane turned around the Atlantic and saw the television pictures, I said, well, there's the turning into a shadow of itself for Manhattan.
Yeah, as Jane mentioned, I was in New York at the time of 9/11 when Osama bin Laden managed to carry out his wishes and inflict serious injury on the United States. And it struck me, just when I was reading some of Robert's works about villages being destroyed in the wars in Syria, in Iraq, that the destruction of the World Trade Center was actually the destruction of my village. Underneath the World Trade Center, there were shops, there were restaurants, there was a hairdresser's. I bought my theatre tickets there. There was a bookshop, Borders bookstore. And 9/11 destroyed my village and killed many of the people that I knew who lived around and who worked and enjoyed that village, especially at the weekends when most of the World Trade Center workers were away. But Robert, 9/11 changed the world for you.
I thought it did at the time, but now I don't think so.
You think what was going to happen would have happened anyway? I mean,
look,
9/11 produced the administration in the United States under George Bush.
The problem, Conor, is that the US administration now puts George Bush into the total darkness.
The point I'm going to make is that would the United States have invaded Iran and would they have invaded Iraq without 9/11?
They needed something to allow them to invade, and they used 9/11.
Well,
it's as simple as that. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm sort of keen at some point that we broaden it out a little bit is that at the moment, compared to 9/11, we live in a much darker world in the Middle East. I mean, who would ever imagine that we'd have a president of the United States who was totally insane, who should be locked up in an institution? And this is true. This is the problem. And these people are popping up everywhere. We won't mention London, but, you know,
I think you should mention London now.
You mean you might die in a dusty ditch? As Fintan O'Toole pointed out so wonderfully, now there's a ditch in which Boris Johnson didn't die. Look, I think that the nationalisms and the racisms of the Western world today are a great danger to the world. and to find, look, there is no American foreign policy, because if you want American foreign policy, you can go to a mental institution and ask the patients, and they'll give you one. There is no serious foreign policy in the Middle East. We have departed totally from all the institutions created out of the Second World War. The United Nations, human rights organizations, International Red Cross. They're all being cast aside. I'm not going to say the world's gone mad, because the world's gone mad before. But I do think, that in the ashes of 1945, sorry to move off into the big world here, but the most senior statesman in Europe, and thank God for people like Schuman, decided that if you have a war and it ends, but you don't fix it, it will turn into a bloody dangerous animal. The First World War we're talking about, of course. And after the First World War, the Allies won, the armistice, humiliating terms for the Germans, massive unemployment, massive poverty, huge nationalisms, total corruption among European politicians. And as Clemenceau said, we've signed a peace treaty and it's going to last for 20 years. And it did, from 1919 to 1939, he got it right. So what the European statesmen were saying after the Second World War, and it's the reason, of course, for the European Economic Community, Common Market, now the EU, is there must never be another war between Germany and France, and then spread it wider and wider. In my view, far too widely, far too quickly, but that's not the point. And I think that what happened later is that people began to retreat from these state-of-the-art institutions. And the EU is a state-of-the-art institution. Whatever you think about it, whatever its dangers and nationalism within it, Thuringia, Poland, Hungary, and so on. And I think the great danger today is that Trumpism, if that's a word we really can use, is becoming normalized. People are not fixing wars. Look at the deal of the century, for heaven's sakes, which effectively takes away the heritage of the Palestinian people and gets away with it, totally. The deal of the century, by the way, was Lord Balfour's deal in 1917 to partition Palestine and create a home for the Jewish people there, which effectively was the end of the Palestinian people. By the way, the Balfour Declaration was only one sentence. It was a Twitter. And what's happened now is that all the iron bars that connected these institutions are beginning to crack. I see them in Beirut, I see it in Syria, I see it when I go to Israel, Palestine, if you want to put it in quotation marks. And I'm not sure why this is happening. It's something to do with nationalism, it's something to do with racism. Look at our reaction, and then I'll shut up for a bit. Look at our reaction to the huge hundreds of thousands of largely Muslim refugees who flooded, I think the word flooded, I've used it, who poured into Europe because their countries had wars that were not fixed, you see. And what was our reaction in most of Europe? What a disaster! And I was sitting in Syria at the time, and then in Iraq, and I said, just a minute, hold on a second. It would have been a disaster, surely, if these million refugees had gone to join ISIS, or if they'd gone to Saudi Arabia. But they preferred to come to us. Is that really such a political international disaster? This was one of those moments when my colleagues attacked me like rats. You see?
Well, talking about your colleagues, I want to bring you back to an event in your career which reflects on the state of the media today. This was a story that you filed from Iran, which was the shooting down by an American warship of an Iranian airliner, which resulted in the deaths of almost 300 people. And you were there, you reported the story.
I was on the boats that were fishing the children out of the water.
Okay, at this time you were still working for the London Times, but the London Times had been taken over by Mr.
Rupert Murdoch. I'm a great hero, yeah.
So what happened when you filed your story?
Well, I'm going to make the story shorter.
You filed your story saying that this was an American warship that shot down the plane.
I said, what I first did, I was actually in Dublin on holiday. I flew straight to Dubai, went to the air traffic control people there, who were all Brits, and I knew most of them. And they said, Bob, the Americans panicked on the warship. It was called the Vincennes. The captain who shot down the airliner was later given an official American award, by the way. And there's no the slightest doubt. We have recordings of them, which they played to me in private, of the Americans panicking. We know now that the American warship was veering away from some Iranian gunboats, little tiny boats, and even the airline timetable they should have been consulting fell onto the wardroom floor. And in the ops room, they couldn't even work out what they would be shooting at, but they said, we're being attacked by an Iranian suicide pilot flying a commercial airliner. Nowadays, of course, that doesn't sound so unlikely. And what happened was that I filed this story as an exclusive. And late at night, I called London from Dubai, and they said, it's not in the paper, Bob, but we'd like, if we could, to emphasize the dangers now of the Americans in the Gulf being attacked by the Iranians in revenge. And I said, Jesus, at first they lied. They said, this is not, it was an editorial decision, but it was not political. And I thought, yes, it bloody was. Much, much later, the former night editor and night sub sent me his diary of that night, and it was quite deliberate that the editor of the time, whose name is Charles Wilson, he's still with us, said, I've never seen such a load of rubbish before in my life. He was Scottish, as you can tell. And later that week, and this really brought it home to me, Vincent Brown, who was then editor of the Sunday Tribune here in Dublin, called me up and he said, Bob, what do you think really happened? And I said, Vincent, I filed the bloody story and they wouldn't run it. It had never happened to me before. My view is that, look, if you have to go into war zones, by the way, later I actually went to Iran and was on the boats fishing dead children out, and I was in the huge cooler warehouse seeing all these children, they're all going to a wedding in Kuwait. This is the famous suicide plane, right? And it was quite clear to me that Vincent had sniffed there was something wrong. I said, Vincent, I'll file the story to you. I'll tell you everything I've got. I've got notebooks and notebooks. And Vincent, front page, and gave 3 other pages in the Sunday Tribune, alas, no longer with us, of course. And there it was. The story was published. And as I reflected at the time, I can write, and the people of County Mayo can read what I found out, but the people of London cannot. What does that tell you?
Do you know, it's quite interesting. 4 airliners have been shot down since then. Actually, the one before that was a South Korean airliner which was shot down in Soviet airspace 1983. And actually, just thinking about that, it was an accident. There were American spy planes in the area at the time, and the Soviet pilots thought it was an American spy plane. Ronald Reagan called it a crime against humanity at the time, I remember. But the story had an interesting coda in that several years later, when that airliner was shot down, the world boycotted for one day all Aeroflot flights as punishment for shooting down the South Korean airliner.
Except for?
Except for one country, and that was Ireland. And years later, when Air Rienta was applying for the duty-free concession in Moscow and Leningrad, I was present at the signing of the ceremony with the head of Aeroflot and the head of Air Rienta, Liam Skelly, I think it was at the time. And the head of Aeroflot told me, when I asked him, why did you pick Air Rienta over Pan Am, which was the other competitor? He said, because you're a semi-state body, but we haven't forgotten that you didn't close Shannon Airport at the time of that tragedy. So,
yes, Russians have long memories, but that goes back to World War II as well, isn't it?
Of course, we had the terrible tragedy just a few weeks ago of the Iranian airliner shot down by the Iranians themselves.
Ukrainian airliner,
the Iranian.
It was a Ukrainian airliner shot down by the Iranians.
Yes. No, a Ukrainian airliner. An Iranian airliner shot down by the Iranians themselves.
Sorry.
Yes.
A few weeks ago, this was a Ukrainian airliner shot down by the Revolutionary Guard.
Okay.
Promise you.
You got that right.
Yes. It matters. Look, the thing is that one of the things I notice now, and just again, broadening it out a bit, is that the ability of governments to influence journalists and the press is much greater now than it was when I went to the north. much greater. If you see, look at the language they use, deal of the century, and suddenly everyone is using deal of the century. But it wasn't, and it's not, it's rubbish. And, you know, look at the word that the British are now using, and believe me, we're going to hear more of this, about the unwillingness to prosecute British soldiers who may have killed innocent civilians in the north. And they call it vexatious cases. What is this vexatious word? Although I notice the BBC uses it all the time. They picked it up, they ate it. I'm still not quite sure what vexatious means. It means it makes someone angry. We know that's someone in Downing Street, don't we? If an innocent...
means collateral damage.
Here we go again. And you know, how many newspapers still use the word collateral damage? And I keep saying it's obscene, and they still use it. They don't have to follow me, but surely there must be some kind of independent thing inside the brain that stops this, but it's not there anymore. Television coverage, I mean, I sometimes get calls from American stations in Beirut, and I simply can't answer their questions because what they're asking me bears no relationship to the world I live in. And, you know, nobody, for example, wants to talk about how ISIS came into existence. And ISIS is a very important, evil institution, but no one will start saying, how did this happen? What did they do? How did they manage? You know, what is this thing that burns people alive in cages and blows them up in cars and drowns them in cages in swimming pools? You know, how did ISIS come about? And I spent months on the Syrian army front line. Yes, the Bashar al-Assad dictator's army. And they would take me out just opposite ISIS lines and take me and show me these black vehicles that they packed with suicide bombers. And I would see dead ISIS people littering the desert. My wife was taking pictures of them. And in some cases, they turned up in modern US tanks, which they'd stolen from near Mosul. And they painted out the original American codings and written in their own. They were setting up this extraordinary, childlike, wicked institution. And I'm going to show you, because I mentioned this to you this morning, I brought with me. They tried to set up their own currency in real silver, copper, and gold. And this comes from Syria. And these are two coins from the, quote, Islamic government. This is a copper coin modelled on 12th century Arab governments. This is a real ISIS coin. And it's real copper. And this is a real ISIS silver coin in real silver. And their idea was, well, we'll recreate even the currency of the few hundred years after the Prophet. I have to tell you that nobody wanted them because they preferred the US dollar, so Trump won anyway. But one of the things as well that they do, we keep thinking, we don't want to think, how did it work, ISIS? How did it work? And one of the things I've noticed is that a lot of the material which I read in Syria, which was printed by ISIS in Syria, and when the Syrian army advanced with the Russians bombing in front of them, I went with them so I could go into Islamic courts with all the records of ISIS court cases on the ground in which the Syrian people totally cooperated. They betrayed their own family to ISIS to try and get some money, get their own back on someone who had married the wrong person. You know? But one of the things I found is that apart from the childish language was that there were clear signs that what they did is they infantilized people. Children don't know the difference between good and evil until you teach them. There was a case in Avignon in France where a girl had left home, and 2 days later her parents, who they were Algerian Muslims of course, went to the police and said, we're very frightened for our daughter. She's left home. And she had gone to Syria and she never returned as far as I know. And the police said, look, you know, we want to see her computer, her laptop. And they found she had 2 Facebooks. And I happened to be in Paris, and I went to see a guy who was a senior French intelligence gendarmerie officer who used to go on these cases, and he had every detail. He had files on what they found, and she had 2 Facebooks. And one of them was all about kids at school, music, holidays. And the other Facebook showed a photograph of Aleppo. Bismillah Allah Muhammad Rasul Allah. I want to go to Aleppo to save the dying women and children. And the ex-policeman said to me, we're trying to find out which is the real Facebook. Do you know the answer? Yes, of course they both were. That's how it works. There's another case. I've got the report here. It was in the suburbs of Paris. I did not attend it. I got the quotations of the court from L'Humanité, the French communist newspaper, in which two returning young men, the French police got them when they came back to France, were taken to court in Paris and arraigned of supporting terrorism. And in a court, when the court stopped for a break, in French courts you do so that people can have a cup of tea and then you go back in. And the judge leant forward and said, I noticed something strange. These young men are behaving like 5-year-olds. One of them has asked his mother to go out and get the chocolate bonbons he enjoyed at school. And they were going to their mothers and fathers and the young wives. In one case, the man, who was a part-time worker on rubbish or refuse in Paris, he actually left for Syria the day after his first child was born. And there was this constant, clear pattern of infantilization, of turning people back and making them go back to a period that they... 2, maybe 4-year-olds, 5 years old.
What is the attraction of ISIS for young women and young men in different countries, one from our own defense forces? What is it that attracts young men to join the caliphate?
I think, you see, one of the problems is that most of the people in the caliphate, and I interviewed some of them in Syrian prisons later. Can you imagine? I sat there pleading for their lives that they wouldn't be executed. Oof. But I should have done that. A human being has got to do that. And I asked them, and most of them were actually Syrians. They were not Europeans. And they gave me a list of all the woes of the Muslim world, which Conor and I have just been telling you about. And from their first days in Syrian villages and Iraqi villages, they learned that the West was evil and killed them. And in many cases, that's exactly what we did. Now, that doesn't mean, here we go, you see, because someone's going to quote it, you cannot justify what ISIS did, wicked terrorists. Of course they were, yes, evil. But you must find out how it happened. And bombing them and calling them apocalyptic, like the Chief of Staff did in the United States, was ridiculous. Not bombing them, you had to fight them. Although in the Syrian case, it was fairly clear that when ISIS attacked the Syrian army, the Americans did not intervene. When they attacked the Iraqi army, they did intervene. So the Americans got quite happy to use their air operations to decide who should survive ISIS's attacks and who should not. Here again, we're going back to the cynicism of the whole Afghan situation. ISIS, for the moment, has gone. I have a friend in Lebanon who said to me last week over coffee, so what extra additional evil will the next? If ISIS can get away with its atrocities, what will the next organization come up with? And this, I think, is what worries a lot of governments, worries the French a lot, that there's going to be something much, much more serious. I'm not predicting it, by the way. I'm just saying that that is the fact at the moment. And my feeling is, you see, that unless you can do what the European Union did at the end of the Second World War, fix these things and do it fairly, you will have another ISIS. You'll get another one. It won't be called the Islamic State of the Levant. It'll be called, the State of Islam in Heaven. You name it. It doesn't matter. Some telephone terrorist will ring up a newspaper and they'll be invented. But going back to my point about how World War I was not fixed, but Second World War was, no one is fixing wars anymore. They're going back to the World War I. Smash Mosul, smash Raqqa. Make someone pay for it. And, there's no point in talking to Trump. He doesn't have the slightest idea.
There are two powers in the Middle East that want to see Syria, the Syrian government, succeed. One is Russia, because Russia has a very important naval base. And ever since Soviet times...
That's not the
Syria,
reason, by the way, but it does have, yes.
The other nation is Iran, because they don't want a Saudi-type kingdom or country on their borders. But you've been following the Syrian war from the Syrian side, almost from the beginning. Your friend Claude Coburn, or Paul, sorry. Yes, nearly. I nearly said Claude Coburn.
Claude Coburn's long dead.
Yes,
he was in the
right,
Spanish Civil War, Conor.
I knew Claude Coburn.
Patrick Coburn, actually.
Patrick Coburn, who's from Waterford, by the way. He covers from the other side. But you've seen from the Syrian side the gradual defeat of the Syrian Free Army and of ISIS.
Free Syrian Army. At one point, I was retreating with the Syrian army and they were losing. Then the Russians arrived. That's where they come in, of course.
We've been reading stories over the years of the Syrians bombing hospitals, committing atrocities. What sort of a country will Syria be once this is all over?
This is the real question. And what sort of country will Iraq be, and Israel, Palestine be, and Egypt be, you see? But we're not planning for futures. We want these people to go back to what they had before. Actually, we were largely happy with all the dictatorships and the torture chambers. Remember, Bashar al-Assad was invited to Bastille Day in Paris with his wife, even though we all knew that they had torture chambers and were massacring prisoners. You know, European governments and American governments and the Canadian government connived when, in rendering citizens who were Arabs back to Syria and got them tortured, because they can't torture them in, Toronto, can they? And actually supplied questions. I know this because I know the man who was given the questions in Syria, by the Canadian authorities to ask the prisoner who was kept in a hole and tortured. What does that mean? You know, we say all these horrible regimes. Yeah, the Syrian regime is horrible. So is ISIS. So is the Egyptian regime. I was asked once, how can you report with an army that has killed journalists? They always mention Paul Marie Colvin. I didn't know her very well.
Whom I knew, by the way.
Sorry?
I knew her from...
But they don't remember the name of the other journalist who was killed with her. And I always say, look, we've got to talk to the bad guys, because otherwise it's going to be a place of secrets. The Israeli army I talked to, but they killed a BBC cameraman in Gaza. I talked to the Egyptian army, and they killed a Sky TV cameraman in that big massacre, a massacre which was on film in Cairo, how many years ago? 3, 4? One of the problems we all have is that we've got to talk to the bad guys. And the moment you stop saying, well, that bad guy is even more worse than that bad guy, you go home. But how do you deal with regimes which actually in the end are supported by superpowers without Russian assistance? The Syrians were in retreat from a town called Jisr-Shugur. I was actually on the front line as they retreated. I was watching them blow up their own anti-aircraft missiles. The whole mountainside was on fire. It was a mass retreat, leaving weapons and tanks behind. And I wrote a story saying, look, they like fighting, but they're outmanned and outgunned, and they're not going to win this. 1 week later, the Russians arrived with their new airbase at Hanin, and that was the turning point. So now we have the Russians supporting the Assad regime. We have the British, even though, Morsi has hundreds of thousands of political prisoners, not Morsi, Sisi. We have a British warship putting into Alexandria Harbour on a courtesy call. We have Trump saying he's my favorite dictator to Sisi. Is it any wonder? And nobody is trying to fix wars. Nobody is trying to work out how to stop it happening again.
You have the Russians now embedded in Syria.
They're not embedded. They're flying over me all the time when I'm there.
You have the Iraqis trying to kick out the Americans out of Iraq. You have torture going on in Iraq, with protesters being shot and being tortured. You have Iraq now under much influence from Iran. Have the Russians outplayed the Americans in the Middle East?
100%. I have a friend in Beirut who refuses always to watch CNN, not a popular station in the Middle East. He's an ex-professor at AUB. And now he says, we can't miss it. My wife and I have breakfast with CNN because every morning we must learn more about the madman in the White House. Now, when you have a situation in which the Arabs mock someone, and they've been saying he's crackers before we did, when you have people who are going to do that, they listen to the Kremlin. The guy may be a dictator and he may have a corrupt government, but he's the guy you listen to. And, but you can't persuade any of this. I mean, what do you do when you have an American president who allows Turkey to invade part of Kurdistan, and in excusing himself, he says, I don't think the Kurds were on D-Day, they weren't at Normandy. On the other hand, I have to say, I don't think Trump was in Vietnam. He actually got 5 deferments, 4 for education, and 5th for a health problem with his feet. Something Hornets called, I can't remember. But the point is, in a world gone mad, that's a cliche, isn't it? I find, and this is one of the things that's very sad for me, that many of my colleagues are still going along. I'm getting attacked for my coverage of the Middle East. Again, just as I was in Belfast. In Belfast, if you went to interview Catholics who'd been beaten up by the British Army, you were obviously pro-IRA. The moment you went to interview Protestants who'd been shot by the IRA, you were with the Crown Forces and possibly a British intelligence officer. And since then, it's been exactly the same everywhere I've reported. Whether it be the Algerian war, where if I talked to Islamists, the Algerians wanted to throw me out, and if I travel with the army, here we go, another murderous army, I was working with the terrorist government. And this goes on and on and on. And it seems to me that one of the problems is that look at some British newspapers now. What happened to the Daily Telegraph? Did it go mad? And I think in not so much the press, but among political elites, in parts of Europe, not here, but certainly in mainland Britain, in America, in Latin America increasingly, I think that I'm trying to think of the right word, I think that there has been a lowering of the educational institutions of politics. I was sitting in Beirut watching the British election, and, they were interviewing, Channel 4 was interviewing people in the street in various cities in Britain. And I'm sorry to say this, but I didn't understand many of them. Not because they had strange accents, but because the educational level was only that they could repeat what governments have said. Well, we've got to get it done, haven't we? Is this the level of... Now, if you have this as a standard, politicians are going to win, from every side that you can imagine. This is not the case, despite Thuringia. In Germany, for example, the educated populations of Western Europe are stunning. And I can tell you that because I lecture to them, and I lecture in America too, we won't go into that. Look at, in America the problem is that you have brilliant universities, well-funded, from sea to shining sea, and it doesn't make the slightest difference. But you take the case, I lecture in Ireland and I lecture in Britain, and originally, the educational levels of the audiences were pretty much level. They all knew what you were talking about. Now, I get a much more, by their response and by their questions, clearly much more intellectually hardworking audience in a place like Galway than I would get now in Bristol. Why? What happened? I know you have huge educational problems in Ireland, although I have to say that in the north, Belfast, like yours, I think the educational level has improved. I'm talking really about higher education. Let's not go into the Irish educational system, but this is look at despite the results, look at the maturity of the February 8 election here and compare it to the language of British politicians in that election. There is no comparison. I'm sounding like Tony Blair, education, education, education. But it is the problem. It's the problem in the Arab world. Everybody says, how do we solve the world? Universities. universities.
One of the questions that has bothered people about the war in Syria is whether or not chemical weapons were ever used.
Whether or not?
Chemical weapons, or weapons, not weapons of mass destruction, but chemical weapons. There have been several reports, and including one report of chemical weapons being used in the suburb of Damascus, in Douma, on the 7th of April 2018. And your report has caused a lot of discussion, fury, because you,
and abuse,
because you contradicted the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which sent a team in and said that they found evidence of the use of chlorine dropped from helicopters.
Look, let's get this right. The Syrian government have used chemical weapons.
They have?
Yes,
okay.
Of course.
Yeah.
And there is substantial evidence that the opposition have used it.
What happened on this occasion?
Well, I rushed to Douma from Beirut when this happened. And I got in within 2 days into Douma. There was still fighting going on at the time. You could hear the shell fire. And I managed to... You remember the picture of the underground hospital, makeshift hospital, with children being washed down and so on. I found the hospital, and I found the senior doctor, who had been 300 meters away at the time, by name, and he said, look, there was asphyxiation, the pictures are real, but it wasn't chemical gas. That night, there were huge amounts of bombs being dropped by the Russians and the Syrians. He didn't doubt that. Stirring up clouds of dust in the street. People thought it was gas and panicked. I didn't say he was right. I just couldn't find anybody who knew the burial place of the dead. I couldn't find anyone who had seen clouds of chemical gas. Again, it's been used by the Syrian government, but on this occasion, I couldn't find the evidence. I did find the evidence of massive underground tunnels, tanks buried in tunnels, put there by ISIS and Nusra, the Islamic groups. And I wrote a story saying, look, I've been there, it may have been used, and of course the importance of whether it was used or not was that the British and Americans bombed sites in Syria, in Syrian sovereign territory, because they had said there was chemical weapons. And it set off a few...
Are you saying that they wanted an excuse to do the bombing?
They always want an excuse to do the bombing. What I was after was, look, I was there, I went there, and I couldn't find the evidence. And of course, immediately I was abused in the London Times, which is not abuse, it's a very high privilege and Medal of Honor. After that, the OEC, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, published a preliminary report which said that there was no use of sarin gas, but there was a probable use of another chemical, maybe chlorine. Now, I have to say, and this is a point I made in the piece, poor people use chlorine to wash their clothes. And if you go into any town, in any Middle Eastern village, and go into a house, you'll smell chlorine. You know, this was not in the report, of course. But as I later discovered, it was in the original report. And some of the inspectors said, your conclusions were not our conclusion, it's been changed. And when I wrote a further report, based on information that I got of what the original report had said, which was clearly quite different, I said, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons is being taken for a ride by somebody. And the sky fell again. And, you know, the question is, so what's the point of carrying on? When all you get, when you dig and dig and dig, is, oh, you're a pro-Assad terrorist, you know? Okay, I give up. You know, so I don't talk to Catholics beaten up by British soldiers, and I don't talk to Protestants killed by the IRA, so I don't talk to Algerian soldiers, so I don't talk to the Egyptians, and on we go. And that is deeply depressing for a reporter of 73 years old.
It's the old problem. If you explain something, you're identified with them. You explain why the IRA exists, you become identified with the...
Yeah, of course.
The speaker.
But, you know, it's a political trick anyway. But with this particular question, I thought, what is it? I mean, other newspapers would not report this, even though they had, in many cases, the same evidence. They wouldn't publish it. What was the switch? Who were the editors group that did? I have no idea. The Independent published it, but we were the only, and the Daily Mail. Amazing.
Peter Hitchens.
Daily Mail let it through. Yeah, they published it.
I saw that.
Yeah, and in fact, it was Chris Hitchens' brother.
That's right.
Peter Hitchens. But this is the question. What happens when the next major crime happens, and I go and report it, and it's not what other people claim it is? And many of the reports of Duma were written from East Beirut, which, if you look at a glance at the map, is a border and about 100 miles away. This is deeply depressing, and it takes a lot of gumption for me, energy, not gumption, to get up in the morning and go after these stories at the moment. Oddly enough, Le Monde was prepared to touch it at least. The Irish Times went for it. But the Irish Times is the best Times on both sides of the Atlantic, so I would expect it to. But again, none of the American press, most of the Italian press, most of the Spanish press, they wouldn't go near the story. What is it? Just to suggest that maybe we're wrong in this case? This is I can't see a way around this. Maybe it's time we ask these people. Maybe they can tell me why.
Quite soon we'll turn this over to the audience, but I have a couple of things I want to ask you about. We haven't talked about the elephant in the room, which is Israel and Palestine.
Strange, isn't it?
Yeah, I think... what do you think of Mr. Trump's, the madman, as you call him? What do you think of his...
the deal of the century.
His deal of the century. Yeah.
100 years after the other deal of the century.
Balfour.
See, Balfour started all this. Now Trump is finishing it off by effectively destroying the Palestinian people as a potential nation. Look,
I remember Brian Lenihan in 1982 calling for a two-state solution, and the sky fell on him because it wasn't acceptable at the time.
I actually saw him at the time and I said, well, I'm not surprised.
Yeah. And then we had Yasser Arafat shaking hands with Yitzhak Rabin, with Bill Clinton at the White House. But there was no mention of a two-state solution then, but subsequently there has been an acceptance that there should be a two-state solution. But I think the door has been closed on that now. How can there be a two-state solution?
There can't be.
And
there isn't meant to be.
Can there ever be?
If you read Amira Haas in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and you should, her belief, and she and I are old friends, and we, in fact, I've included her in a big film I've made about the Middle East. Her view is that Oslo was not meant to create a two-state solution, and that's why you couldn't solve the major problems in Oslo, Jerusalem, return of refugees, separate state, until you'd gone through all these little points which allowed the Israelis to move soldiers there, but keep them here and so on. And I think that now nobody even talks about it anymore. Gideon Levy in Haaretz you should read. There are a bevy of fine Israeli journalists, much braver than any of our American colleagues, in talking about the scandal of what is happening. But effectively, Trump has said it's okay to annex Palestinian territory. This will always come back to things like, let me give you an example and just go slightly to the sideline. People will say, to me, sometimes in lectures I give, do accept the right of Israel to exist. Of course, it's a trap, because if you say yes, you're out of the picture, and if you say no, you're an anti-Semite. My reply is quite simple. I say, show me where Israel is. Would you draw it on a map for me? Can I see the eastern border? Is it Jerusalem? Is it Ramallah? Is it the Jordan River? We don't know where the eastern border is, and the Israelis don't know because it's not there. And my belief, and Gideon Levy will say this, is that the right-wing Israeli governments, and even calling them right-wing now is becoming a bit modest, or moderate rather, they are going to go through to the river. Now, I always say, look, I accept the right of Israel to exist in the international frontiers which are accepted at the United Nations. What I do not accept is an Israel which includes Jericho or large areas of the Palestinian West Bank. For example, if you said to me, does the United Kingdom have a right to exist? I'd say, well, if you show me a map and it includes England, Scotland, Wales, we'll leave Northern Ireland out for a moment, Yes, it does have a right to exist. But if the map of the United Kingdom includes Dublin and Cork, no, it does not. Why don't we apply the same, if you have a map of the United States, but Texas is part of Mexico, what American would ever accept America's right to exist without Texas, or Mexico's right to exist with Texas? But only in Israel could you change the frontiers and take other people's territory. I mean, under the Ottoman Empire, we had the Armenian genocide. Now, that's not happening in Israel. And I'm tired and sick of people who make comparisons of Israelis with the Nazis or deny the Jewish Holocaust. There may have been, in my view, 7 million dead, given what I learned in Russia about the unknown mass graves of Jews in Russia. But the Holocaust happened. It is real. Auschwitz is real. I've been there 4 times. But that does not permit, and should never permit, a country in the Middle East to take another people's land and have the world's greatest superpower say, we approve.